So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to our fourth session of the second semester in the Buber seminar, and very happy to see you all back, even after these technical problems. Some people are still on their way. Today, so last time we spoke about we listened to Patricia's talk, and we spoke about the relation between Buber and Levinas. We talked about the ethical dimensions of the intersubjective relation, the I-thou relation. One of the things that we talked about was the more equal, let's say, horizontal relationship between I and thou in Buber's thought, and maybe the more vertical, hierarchical notion of that relationship in Levinas. And you mentioned at the end that it might be a good idea to go into a question that we've been talking about more often. And we started with it really in the beginning of the year, and that is the question of the I-thou relation in the therapeutic relationship. I had already said last time that for me it's a real question what the relation is between, or how to think about the I-thou relationship and the unconscious, and what is the relation between the two, and how can we think about how they might what they might have to say to each other. So we sent out some pre-reading, a short text called The Unconscious from one of Buber's last publication, sort of a collection of various fragments from the mid-60s. And we have with us a guest speaker today, Professor Abramovich, and we're very, very happy. I'm very happy to be able to welcome him into our seminar, who will speak to us about this topic. And Professor Abramovich is Emeritus Professor in the Medical School of Tel Aviv University. He is a Jungian psychoanalyst, or Jungian analytical psychologist, and founding president of the Israel Institute for Jungian Psychology. He holds a doctorate in anthropology from Yale University, and he is also a playwright and a novelist, and has written a play called Meetings, the Life Teachings of Martin Mordecai Buber. So there's a play about Buber, and he has also written a play about the meeting between Carl Jung and Leo Baeck shortly after the war. Professor Abramovich, we're very, very happy that you are here with us to help us to think about this relationship between the I-thou dialogue and the therapeutic or the helping relationship. So we will. I've also sent around a paper that Professor Abramovich co-authored with, I forgot the name now of the co-author, maybe you can help me. Elisa Schwartz, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Shalom from Jerusalem. Hello and peace from Jerusalem. I have to apologize in advance. I'm going to leave at 5:30 because I have a prior engagement. But, you know, as Buber said, the I-thou is timeless. So hopefully we'll be able to engage, even though we're on Zoom and even though we're in different sorts of places. I first learned about Buber from my mother, who kept a copy of I and Thou next to her bed, heavily underlined and engaged. And I think she taught me what an I-thou experiences was, and we'll come back later to Buber's mother. Now, I don't think it's as well known, but Buber had a lifelong interest in psychiatry, mental health, and psychotherapy. He took 3 semesters in psychiatry while he was a student and studied with among the greatest psychiatrists of the age, including Wilhelm Wundt, who was still considered the father of modern psychology in Germany. But even more importantly, he studied with Bleuler, who coined the term schizophrenia, and was Carl Jung's teacher and mentor at Burgholzi Hospital, which was one of the creative centers for psychiatry and innovation at the time. He also, as you perhaps do know, he had a lifelong friendship and long correspondence with Ludwig Binswanger, who was the founder of existential psychotherapy. He also corresponded with Freud and even asked him to join a series that he was editing, even though he profoundly objected to psychoanalysis as a system based on I-it. And if you think about psychoanalysis, there are 2 things that make true dialogue impossible in psychoanalysis. One is the position of the analyst out of sight, behind, and you can't even see them. You can't even have any direct contact with them. And secondly, at least in classical psychoanalysis, things have changed a lot since then. everything is, you can never really have access to the analyst. Everything is mediated through the counter-transference relationship, and therefore dialogue was not done. And since one of Buber's key ideas is that a person is not sick alone, that's a kind of fallacy. And a fallacy that challenges all of modern psychiatry, that we're like individuals who have illnesses on the medical model. He felt people are always sick in between, and the healing has to come from the in-between. And he invented this phrase called healing through meeting, which then Hans Trub, who had been a student of Jung's, wrote a book that was published after his death. It's still a very important idea, that it is the meeting itself which creates the healing in that space, in the in-between, which is a phrase he had. He had a very close and long relationship with Emma Jung, Carl Jung's wife, who herself was a very important analyst and author, and also had a very ambiguous relationship with Carl Jung himself. They had a rather bitter public exchange of letters on the nature of spirituality in the Swiss papers, but Jung wrote very carefully. He said he had no personal animus to him, and Buber even spoke at Eranos at some point, which you can imagine that has to do. Their controversy had to do with something that's very interesting to me personally, is that when you have an inner voice, how do you know whether that's the voice of the self, which Jung would argue, or rather the voice of the devil? And indeed, when you have the experience of truth speaking within you, it's very difficult to understand what is the difference of this. And clearly, we know so much about Hitler's life. There's no question he felt that he was on a divine mission, that God was speaking to him, and he was carrying out these missions out of a sense of truth. So you can't know it only alone, the way perhaps a classical Jungian would see with it. You have to see it more in an interpersonal or relational context to understand whether this is true. And it's very much true of the great spiritual innovators like Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha. After they've been in the desert, either literally or metaphorically, they have to have somebody else recognize them as speaking truth. Otherwise, they're really crazy. So this is, again, the interpersonal is what makes you human and things like that. Since then, I would say his influence has only grown, not only in existential psychoanalysis, particularly in relational psychoanalysis, which says it's the relationship that heals, and people cite him. And it's as if Buber's gone through a renaissance in psychology, and perhaps of all of the many, many fields that Buber influenced, and he influenced many, it's very likely to have the strongest influence in psychotherapy and continuing influence today. So he's definitely not a thing. There isn't even one school of psychotherapy which sees Buber as his founder. And other people like R.D. Lang, Leslie Farber, who you may know, and others very much saw about him. And there have been Buberians, in the therapy world who have applied his work very creatively to work with very difficult people, prisoners, social workers, therapeutic communities, dream groups, like things I do, ecological psychotherapy, and so forth. But if I would sum up his contribution in his time, his greatest insight is that dialogue and authenticity are at the heart of psychotherapy and not insight and interpretation. So I don't think he was against insight interpretation. He was a master of hermeneutics. He loved to interpret, his books on the Bible and so forth, things like that. But it's the relationships itself that heals. Within the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy, he received an amazing recognition, which is he was invited to give one of the most prestigious lecture series that still exists, the William Allison White Institute. And he gave a series of I think, 7 lectures, and these were published in the journal Psychiatry, and then collected in the book, The Knowledge of Man, a philosophy of the interhuman, which I certainly recommend to you. Now, what I thought to do is to give you kind of like a taste, a Vorspeise of some of the aspects of Buber's thought that influence therapists today in general, and me personally. And the first one has to do with the notion of guilt. Buber felt, and I think correctly, that many psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapies, which was certainly dominant at that time, and is still today in the time of CBT and things like that, saw guilt as something negative, something you got rid of. Woody Allen, you're worried about everything, you're anxious about everything, and the idea is that a good therapy gets rid of guilt. Now, Buber, as a Jew, was deeply offended by this. You know, I have a cute line that says, the Jews know all about guilt, but we don't make a religion out of it. But we you know, you can't be Jewish without knowing about guilt, because it's like deep, you know, deep in the culture. And he made a distinction between what he called actual guilt and neurotic guilt. And it was like, it was sinful to confuse the two. Now, guilt, what he said, better way of putting it is like guilty feelings. I think it's a better translation of the German. So guilty feelings are the feeling when you feel like you did something wrong, but you really didn't do something wrong. I can give you an example, you know, from today. I have a client, every time something goes wrong in a relationship, he automatically blames himself. He doesn't even see whether the other person was at fault, whether he was being manipulated. Oh, it's like an automatic thing. And we know clearly this goes back to how children protect themselves by making the parents seem good and them bad, because it gives the hope that maybe if they're a better child, then the parent will be a better parent. Okay, those are guilty feelings. Or say you have like, you know, I treat ultra-Orthodox Jews. Sexual fantasies are really not a good thing. You should feel guilty about this kind of thing. But from the point of view of mental health, I'm saying, if it's just a fantasy, that's fine. Those are things that we want to help the person get rid of those guilty feelings. In contrast, he talked about actual guilt. Actual guilt is when you really did something wrong, and that should not be taken away. On the contrary, it should be illuminated, to put a hotspot on what happened, to try and understand what happened and how it happened. And one should persevere. That's the second stage. The first stage is like illuminating the guilt. The second stage is persevering in that, because we don't want to face up what we did. Many people don't want to, and so forth. And then the third phase is he felt there should be a tikkun, a kind of repair at the place in the human order where it had been injured. And I wanted just to make my point, since I write about the Bible a lot, talk about, say you got a patient who was Cain, like in the Bible. He had killed his brother, perhaps accidentally, perhaps intentionally, and he has actual guilt. So you don't want to take away the bad feeling he had. And indeed, in the Midrash, the Jewish heritage, there is a story that after Cain wanders for many years, he reflects on his deeds. And this is actually based on a translation of the Hebrew word. When he gets his punishment, Cain says, Gadol avoni laset, which is usually translated, my punishment is too big for me to bear. And that makes him into kind of like a wimp, somebody who can't face up to responsibilities. But I believe the true translation, which is as legitimate as this, is saying, my sin is too big for me to bear. That it's a moment of illumination, a moment of realization. What did I do? What did I do? And his wandering forces him to lose his home, to find a place, and to understand. And he goes through a process. And eventually he meets his father, Adam. And Adam says, what, are you still alive? And Cain says, yes, because I made the tikkun. I returned, to use the Hebrew. I returned, and God forgave me. And Adam slaps his head and says, my Lord, I didn't know that such forgiveness existed in the world. Back to Cain as the patient. So the first thing is to illuminate the guilt. The second thing is to keep him focused on it, like not to run away, not to have easy ways out, not to say, oh, he deserved it. Oh, it was all unfair. No, take responsibility. And then Buber said that even though you killed your brother, there's a way of making a tikkun. You can't bring your brother back. That's like water spilling through your hands. But you could make sure that these kinds of events will never happen again. And that's the nature of true tshuva, which Buber clearly believed in, which is, it's not saying you're sorry. It's being in exactly the same situation and doing it different. So that's then to search to make a tikkun, whether, you know, in some way or other. There was actually a case in California where a drunk driver killed a rabbi's son, and the man begged, he was a Christian, the man who did it, he begged for forgiveness. He says, I'll forgive you, but here are 10 things you have to do to make sure. You have to go school to school. You've got to go everywhere and make sure that no other drunk driver is going to do this. You have to change your life. And if you do that, I'll forgive you. So without being in the same situation, you can't do that. So here you can see that this is a very different view of a kind of intrapsychic, psychoanalytic view of like getting rid of neurotic guilt, as opposed to acting in the world as a kind of relational thing of helping somebody find a way to find a tikkun that will not only benefit him, but benefit the people around him. Now, I mentioned my mother. So my mother was really a loving, open-hearted person, but Buber's mother, as you know, was not. And indeed, my favorite book of all of his many books, I don't know how many books he wrote, but lots, is his small book of autobiographical fragments. So first of all, the idea of fragments says something about therapy, that it's not a continuous narrative as a fiction that we live for ourselves, but our life is really made up of intense, distinct events that those really carry the burden of existence and meaning for us. Now, the first story is this famous story, which I assume all of you know, but I'm going to tell it anyway, is that he tells the story like this. He says he doesn't remember how old he was, probably about 5. He was in the country talking to an older girl, and he doesn't remember asking the question, but he remembers the answer. And the answer is no, she'll never come back again. And he says he had no doubt of the truth of this statement. And the she, of course, referred to his mother, who abandoned him when he was 3 years old for her lover and for her life on the stage, which she had left to marry Buber's father, who was not such a sophisticated guy, and was therefore left on his own. What's interesting, I would say, by most psychoanalytic and also psychological leads, you would expect somebody whose mother abandoned him to be severely disturbed, to have difficulty making attachments. You know, whereas Buber had a kind of resilience, perhaps through his grandparents who looked after him, perhaps even through his father, who was kind of, you know, amiable, not much of an authority. Probably the languages helped him. He could speak many languages to himself, even though as Buber, I think as Paul has taught me, his first language was the Yiddish and not German, and his German, you know, wasn't as good as many people think it was. In any case, Buber, but he was also very creative, and being creative and being intelligent helps you in life. One thing Buber loved to do is invent words. Now, he's been criticized for this because there are words that he just invents, but I think he did them because he was working against language, against the limits of language, in a way that resembles his fellow Austrian Wittgenstein. You know, Wittgenstein's solution was perhaps just to be silent. Buber tried to find a way to talk about things that can't be talked about. He said, everything I learned about dialogue, I learned on the balcony with my friend. And undoubtedly it's true. In Jungian terms, we would say that Buber became the wounded healer. Because he was wounded, he was able to heal so many people through his writings, his work, his philosophy, and his ability to be engaged in this way. So that's one thing. When he reflected back on this idea, he thought about the German word for meeting. And the normal German word for meeting is Begegnung, which is like a coming together, more or less. He then felt that what he had experienced with his mother was the opposite of a coming together. And so he invented a word putting the negative on Begegnung, which became Vergegnung, pardon my pronunciation, which is a mismeeting or miscounter. And in the end of this piece, he says the next time he saw his mother was 30 years later. Imagine 30 years, no contact. He already was a father with young children. She came to the dinner table and he saw her beautiful, sparkling blue eyes and also the word Vergegnung. Now, the importance for Vergegnung or mismeeting or miscounter is that this is what causes psychopathology. Places in our lives, with our parents, with our friends, with our dogs. He talks such a mismeeting about with his horse, you know, about things. These are the things that cause what I would call would be mental illness. And I think he would say is like a disturbance in the dialogical relationship, where you're cut off from the other, where you're cut off from yourself because you're overly involved with the other. So that's, I think, a very interesting and valuable word. We can talk more about that later. I'm trying to be concise to leave a lot of time for discussion. Another thing that where Buber has, another completely, I feel like it's Monty Python. And now another thing about Buber. Buber perhaps was most famous in his time for his Hasidic stories. And it's true that Gershon Scholem correctly criticized Buber for boderizing them, for taking out all of the mystical and magical elements in the stories, which undoubtedly he did. But he did so, I think, very consciously, because he wanted to make these universal treasures accessible to people who knew nothing about Judaism. And in this, he was wildly successful. Now, one thing that we therapists use in our work, especially Jungians, but I would say all of them, but especially Jungians like me, is we use what we call amplifications. So say we feel somebody's like stuck, so we might tell them a myth. We might refer to a movie. We might refer to an artwork in this way. We also refer to Hasidic stories that Barton Buber made famous. And I'll tell you one that I've told more than once. And it's a story, if you know, is one of the most famous in his collection. It's called The Prince Who Thought He Was a Turkey. So this is a very famous story. There was a king, and he had a prince who, in like psychiatric terms, was a kind of had a psychotic breakdown. He would go naked, strip himself naked, and he would crouch down underneath the table and peck at scraps that would fall from the table and make noises like a turkey. And many healers came from all over the world to try and help him because it was the king's things. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. Finally, a man came and he said, I can heal him, but you have to do exactly what I say. When I move my right hand, throw down a pair of pants. When I use my left hand, throw down a shirt. Otherwise, don't say anything. That already is like healing from the outside often looks really weird. So what does the man do? He immediately also strips down, crouches underneath the table, and starts pecking at the scraps that fall down. After a few hours, the prince comes up and says, what are you doing here? So the man says, what do you mean, what am I doing here? I'm a turkey. I'm a turkey too. So they peck and go on together. And after a few hours, the man turns to the prince and says, you can be a turkey and wear pants. Really? So he puts up his hand, they throw down pants, they put on pants. 2 hours later, so this, you can be a turkey and wear a shirt. So they put on shirts, and gradually he came back to society. Now, like any good story, this could be interpreted in many ways. I often think somebody said something very interesting. What's the difference between an interpretation in literature or philosophy and an interpretation in psychotherapy? A good interpretation in psychotherapy relieves the symptom. A good interpretation in literature or philosophy just leads to another good interpretation. It's endless in the way of doing the story. This story, I think, says that there is a pathway back from madness. And the pathway is not necessarily giving up your delusions. You can live with your delusions so long as you live with people and not by yourself. And people who do suffer from things like schizophrenic, one of the things they feel is like they're so totally alone, nobody understands them, they lost their status as a human being, and they're completely isolated. Once you can engage them, then step by step you can bring them back into society. It also reflects the kind of attitude of at some point in mental health, and like in communist countries, there was a tremendous concern that people believe the same thing. And let me tell you about a very interesting experiment that was done originally in the States, but actually then all over the world, in London and Israel and many, many other places. People would show up at the emergency room, and they would say 3 lies. They would say, actually just one lie. They would say, I hear a voice saying blank, empty. That's all they would say. Otherwise, they were completely themselves. These were like housewives, lawyers, gardeners, all kinds of people. On the basis of that statement alone, they would be hospitalized. As soon as they were hospitalized, they never said that again. They just became themselves. How long do you think it took for them to get out of the psychiatric ward? 51 days on average. Very interesting from a Buber point of view, when the patients would go up to the doctors and try to get some eye contact, some relationship with them and say, like, what's happening with me? They would always look away and not deal with these sorts of things. This article is called On Being Sane in Insane Places, of finding that way, of dealing sort of thing. This story, I think, as I've used it, people says, you can keep believing whatever you believe, but come with us into society, and your private life is your own. Even if I think it's completely wacko, crazy, delusional, whatever, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me, are you able to live a satisfying life, a fulfilling life, to have relationships? That's the indication of what it is, and so forth. So that's the power of these stories. And of course, stories like jokes can say something much more powerfully than putting it into discursive language in the system. Another of my okay, now I feel like, again, really something else. Another story in that book of meetings, the autobiographical fragments, is a story that really always touched me. And I think it's so poignant, I think I'll actually try to read it. It's called The Conversation, even though it's a very odd title, as you'll see. And this is an extract from these short stories, from that vignette. It says, so this is Buber talking about himself. What happened was no more than one forenoon after a morning of religious enthusiasm. Quite rare to him. He had a kind of mystical awareness. He wrote a lot about mysticism, like most mystics, but he didn't have much personal experience of it, so forth. But he had one. He says, like, the veil was ripped away and you could see the beyond. Like a real spiritual experience. So after that, I had a visit from an unknown young man without being there in spirit. I certainly did not fail to let the meeting be friendly. I did not treat him any more remissly than all of his contemporaries, who were in the habit of seeking me out about this time as an oracle that is ready to listen. I conversed attentively and openly with him. Only I omitted to guess the question he did not put. Later, not long after, I learned from one of his friends that he was no longer alive. The essential content of these questions, I learned he had come to me, not casually, but born by destiny, not for a chat, but for a decision. He had come to me. He had come in this hour. For me as a therapist, this is a terrifying story for me, because I'm always worried I'm not hearing the question that the patient is not asking. And we do say we listen with our third ear. We try to hear beyond the text. We try to hear into the person. We try to feel the unconscious through projective identification, or in other subtle ways. But this is something that really is very poignant, of hearing something and how potently, for good or for bad, this kind of thing. In the same thing, I think he has another line that says like this, which certainly speaks to me. He says, what does somebody expect when they are in despair and yet come to you? So what do they expect when they are in despair and yet come to you? And he answers, surely a presence by the means of which there is nevertheless meaning. So it's not something you say, it's not something you do, it's just a presence that conveys that I, thou quality that there is, or in German, I think there's a word like to say yes to somebody. First of all, say yes. First of all, open up to them in this different sort of way. Okay, and then I think the last thing I'll talk about is taken from the article, or I think you just got the abstract, I think was this. And this has to do with my work as a medical educator. And I have a friend who I wrote this paper with, Eliezer Schwartz, who's an eminent doctor, particularly in infectious disease and corona and many other things. His father was a very, very eminent philosopher here in Israel, unfortunately died young, Moshe Schwartz, and Paul knows him and highly regards his work. And we were both very interested in Buber, and we wanted to see how to combine it to use it in medicine. Now, one of the difficulties in I, thou is I, thou, and I, it, they seem very dichotomous, very discrete. Either you're in an I, thou relationship, or you're in an I-it relationship. There's no gradations. They're completely different. They're these primary words, spoken, in the in-between, and so forth. And we felt, well, how can we combine? No, we felt medicine has to combine the I, thou, and the I-it in a framework that allows space for the other. And that's what we tried to do in this little article, to say, when a patient comes to the doctor has to be in I-thou mode. He has to see, who is this person, this unique person who is coming to me now. Indeed, one of the questions we always try to teach young doctors is, when somebody comes for you for a problem, you always try to say, well, why have you come now? What's changed that made you feel that now you should enter the sick role? What's happened? And that provides very valuable clinical, but also existential material, because very often there's a psychosocial trigger that's involved in this, not necessarily a biomedical one. So you have to receive the person. And this isn't a matter of time. I mean, doctors often have very little time today with managed care and so forth, but it's not a matter of time. It's as if to receive the patient in their wholeness. As I say, in this I-thou mode, to be seen, to be listened. And perhaps this is something that Michael Balint, who was a Hungarian psychoanalyst who moved to London and created a new approach to family medicine, GP as it was at the time. He felt that doctors needed to be able to do psychotherapy in 10 minutes, and he succeeded. And then he saw that they needed a place to talk about their most difficult cases, and he created what are Balint groups. And these are things all over the world where family doctors particularly sit together in a peer group and talk about their most difficult patients and think about them and get support from one another. So he said, the doctor is the best pill. So is that not Buber?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. But the next thing is, to understand what the ailment of the doctor is, you have to then shift to I-it mode. You have to treat the body as an object of medical concern. You have to examine, you have to do blood tests, you have to do visualizing, you have to shift from one mode to the other. And you just have to say you're doing it. And it's something we also teach, which are transition statements, which is saying, okay, well, now I have to focus on this. You know, I have to look in your eye, I have to go examine your heart. You know, I have to go look at the x-rays and so forth. And then I think what's unique in the paper is to say, then we have to combine the I-it within the I-thou that's established beforehand. And that's in the way you reconnect with the person as this unique person, but with the information that you now have from the I-it element to then reestablish a dialogue with the patient. And with that dialogue, then the patient can be a partner in his treatment. And we know from so much research that if the patient doesn't get this I-thou relationship, they don't do what the doctor suggests, especially if it's something that might even help him. Because you have to trust the doctor, you have to feel it's connected. Or like with Corona, if you trust the system, or if you trust the doctor, the nurse, whatever, then you might do things. If you have mistrust, you're very unlikely to do this. And chances are, you know, in research, we talk a lot about placebo. I'm sure you've all heard about placebo in the Corona research. Placebo is a positive part of every medical interaction. That is, if you feel this sense of connection with the doctor, you're already getting better. And think about the last time you went to a doctor who you liked, who connected with you. You already felt better. And think about the opposite. Now they made up a new word, nocebo. Think about a doctor who didn't look up from the computer screen, you know, or insulted you, talked down to you, whatever. You already feel worse. Not only want to, you know, just stomp out. I know that's what I feel, and you know, I do this for a living and so forth. So I think how to combine I-thou, I-it, and then I-it within an I-thou that allows for an ongoing dialogue. Okay, I think I'll stop here, and you know, we'll have time for dialogue.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction into our topic, and yes, very, very wonderful anecdotes as well. The bit about conversation we have looked at in a previous session, so that's great that comes back, and we've noted how important that was also for Buber. So I think we've heard quite a lot, And maybe we can start with some questions and discussion. Is there anyone who would like to start? Or maybe it has to sink in a little bit. Maybe, okay, Vic, you start. First Vic, then Daniel, and I have a question too.
Henry, that was just wonderful to listen to, and the kind of the shifts. So I was wondering, as a Jungian, what difference it makes when you're a doctor. Because in reading the piece, there were certain kind of tensions when I think there's a woman with a heart condition doesn't stay, who doesn't come back. It was a cancer condition. She doesn't come back, but it's kind of left in the air a bit.
Well, I think what you're referring to is what we called the malignant mismeeting.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, it was somebody who the doctor wanted to have a colonoscopy.
Yes.
But was very abrupt with this person in a way that they then went off and were very likely to develop cancer that would be too difficult to treat. Whereas colon cancer, if you get it early, it's very easy to treat.
Yes, so I was thinking about that moment and that relationship or non-meeting, which she felt either disrespected or not heard, or something didn't happen in that meeting. So I was thinking about the difference between the meeting with the doctor and the meeting with the therapist, or how that might have been different, or how you characterize the difference.
Well,
the meeting with the doctor, the meeting with the therapist.
Yeah. So I'll say, I mean, we therapists have it good. I meet my patients, I mean, literally, we have it good. We have, I see patients, say, for 50 minutes alone, no interactions, no interruptions, no other things. I can totally focus on this patient. I also can deal with the difficulty that they may have in establishing a relationship, of say they have a history of not being feeling understood. And they might feel it with me, but I wouldn't allow it just to act out. We would then be able to re-engage and talk about and discuss how this pattern was, how they were feeling, and then to bring a kind of tikkun there. Doctors, I would say, are supposed to be doing that, but they're under severe time limits, usually, and time pressures. The main problem today for doctors is burnout, because they're not given enough, I think, emotional support, and they have to do too much. Also, doctors, unlike any other profession, they have to work these days and nights. And there's no choice in the matter. They just have to do it. And there's no real rationale for this except its history of having to do that. Imagine like giving lectures all night and then having to wake up, not having to go to sleep and having to give lectures all day the next day. I mean, it's just, you wouldn't allow a lecturer to do that. So I would see that. The other thing is I think in our medical school, I would say we work very hard to try and train medical students and doctors to be able to enter into dialogue with their patients. And we do this through a whole series of throughout all the years of medical school, from like theory, role-playing, simulations, feedback, ongoing feedback, and so forth of having to do. I won't say everyone comes out well. In addition, to get into a medical school in Israel, you have to pass a day of simulations to show that you have at least this basic ability to relate to people. So you might be the top student in your class, but if you don't know how to relate to people, have like basic things like to apologize, which people who have personality disorders have great difficulty doing, then you won't get into medical school, even if you're the top student. So I don't know if that answers you, but.
No, it's helpful, but it kind of opens up different questions. I just wondered personally, in terms of your own development from being a kind of anthropologist to, did you then become a doctor and then become a therapist? And
well, let me correct that. I'm not a doctor. I'm a psychologist and an anthropologist, so I'm not a medical doctor.
So you work with, so in your position, you kind of work with medical students, but you're not.
Yes, yes.
And so that you can bring different things to the medical school that other people can't, in a way.
Yes.
But it can be that they don't, that a lot of people presumably in authority in those positions don't necessarily understand or appreciate what it is that you're trying to bring, because they don't necessarily have those relationships with themselves necessarily.
Yes,
to understand what you're trying to offer. That's
a very good point. But the way we got the authorities behind us is that from evidence-based medicine, if you don't have good dialogue with your patients sue you, your patients get sicker, your patients don't do what you say. So it's in solid positivist interest to do these sorts of things.
Okay, great. We can pick that up later, these questions. Let's go to Dan now.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you for a wonderful talk. I enjoyed every moment. I want to just push further on this discrete I, it, and I, thou. It just felt to me that even in the system you're proposing, I don't think one can ever forget either side if you're a medical doctor or a therapist, so that even while examining a patient, the doctor still should have a human relationship with them. And even when one is trying to establish trust and I, thou, the doctor can't forget or unlearn their medical awareness and knowledge. They may still be looking for clues that are factually useful. And similarly in therapy, if one's using transference in a proper way, in other words, that you are engaging with a person but finding feelings in yourself, and you have to ask, is this from me or are they getting under my skin? Again, there's a simultaneous dialogue engagement combined with analysis and knowledge of past cases. So that's really my question. Isn't it always the case that you want to be holding on to both possibilities?
Well, I think what I said in the medical thing, it's clearer. That is, I think you need to start with I, thou. Even the I, it, you shouldn't alienate the person. You shouldn't be completely dealing with it, but you need to get very specific information that's not necessarily connected to the relationship. Similarly, I think, if I think in therapy, yes, I am thinking all the time, is this coming from me? Is this coming from them? But at the same time, I'm hopefully not losing touch with the patient. Let me tell you another bugaboo of mine. Most work in the psychoanalytic world is very theoretical and deals very little with what people actually do. But in actual practice, people think very little about theory because you have to be engaged with the person. Personally, I use theory, I would say, occasionally in therapy, but especially when I feel something is going wrong. Then I need a map. Then I need to try to understand what's going on. If I'm thinking theory in the relationship, then I'm going to lose touch with the patient. And there's this famous analysis of Freud's 5 case studies, which is they transformed clinical failure into narrative success. Yeah, so I think we have to, in practice, see, when I said Buber made them very discreet and things like that, in practice, I don't think they're so discreet. There's either a continuum or you can have one, piggybacked on the other.
Okay, thanks. Jose.
Hi, thank you very much for this amazing talk. I will have a very naive question because I was listening to you and I was remember some process. So the problem of the in-between and trying to relate with some cases which I had studied or at least read, not so deeply as I want to, that I was asking to you if questioning if the healing process cannot be not a human, but a medium. And I was wondering about Daniel Boschreiber, the memories of mental illness, or Avi Warburg, or even another ones. If the in-between cannot be a human medium such as writing, which has so in the history so powerful skills in the process of healing.
Well, that's an extremely good point, and I'm very glad you raised it. Buber himself, he talks about the I thou with the tree. In the autobiographical fragments, he talks about his relationship with his horse and things like this. So actually, the most exciting frontier today of psychotherapy is not between humans, but say humans and animals, which is extremely effective, particularly with, say, children, with people with dementia, with different sorts of things. Also, I mentioned ecotherapy. The use of nature is extremely important, of reconnecting. Jungians, we might say you're reconnecting with the Great Mother, but you establish a dialogue, you can see things, gardening, even cooking, in the way of reestablishing different sorts of ways of doing this. So I think that's extremely important development. And again, very much in the spirit of Buber. I'll say even more, today in Europe, there's a directive that you cannot build a new psychiatric hospital without a healing garden attached to it.
Okay. Can I ask a question as well? And then hopefully other people also have some comments. So you made a really interesting Freudian slip in your talk.
Yes.
You said that the doctor is the best pill. That was that quotation. And then you were going on to say you have to do the I-it in order to find the illness of the patient, but you said the illness of the doctor. Uh-huh. And I thought that was beautiful, because at the end of this text, the unconscious, Buber also sort of slips a little bit there, maybe, I don't know, because he says the teacher is a tragic person, can never really do what he or she sets out to do, but sometimes the therapist, when they're lucky healing, they can heal. But it seems to me that certainly in psychotherapy, but maybe also in the healing of the soma, what the doctor does is create the conditions under which the patient can heal themselves. The body can heal, or the mind can heal, and this I-thou relationship would appear to be a kind of frame within which that can happen. So my question here has to do with so what then is the place of the unconscious in the I-thou relationship? Because as you said yourself, I'm quoting from I and Thou, the I-thou relationship is a relation with the whole person, with the uniqueness of the person, and it's a kind of, and Buber says this, you can only relate to Thou as a whole I, or to the whole Thou, and not to part of it. The I-it relation is partial, the I-thou relation is whole. At the same time, when he talks about the unconscious, he says, the unconscious, Freud got it wrong, he made a logical error. It's not psychic material that's been repressed, but it's the unity of the body and the mind that is forever out of reach, and that is the whole person. So is he now saying that in the I-thou relationship, we're actually doing precisely that relating between unconscious and unconscious would fit in with that he says also, I don't know anything about the person I'm saying down to, I only know everything, or is it something else? And if it is the same, then what does it mean for the therapeutic relationship? Your model of these three stages seems to have a kind of I-it cradled by two I-thou moments. Could you say, or could you not say, that also, let's say, in the analytic setting, that is the model? There is first a relational element in which the analyst has to say, you can be my patient, and the patient has to say, I can be you can be my analyst. Yeah. And then an I-it moment would happen in which the mechanics of the unconscious are worked through. And then an I-thou relation would take over again in terms of what does this mean for the life of the patient.
Well,
so how?
Yeah, well, let me say a few things in reaction. First of all, you may be right, that is, in the analytical setting, say like where I would work, what's very important is what we call the frame. And that would be more I-it in the way you're talking about it. Like, we're going to meet at this time. If there's a fee, I mean, I also do volunteer work, but if there's a fee, this is the fee. And also, it will end. There also is something unique in the therapeutic relationship. It's the only intimate relationship that you know is going to end. Even though there may be this illusion that it's going to go on forever, but it's designed to end. And that's a good thing, to work for the conclusion of this sort of thing. So the therapeutic thing would be in a way like the opposite of the medical, the mirror. Because the medical, you have the I-thou and the I-it in the middle. And the therapeutic, you have this very short, hopefully short, but telling, very important, framing through I-it, the conditions, the thing, and so forth. And then within that, hopefully you have plenty of encounter and connection and so forth. So that I would agree with very much, and I think that's very clarifying, Johan. I'm not sure that Jung certainly felt that the relationship between the person and the unconscious, he had this famous diagram of like, you have a dialogue with the patient, you have a dialogue with the patient's unconscious, they have a dialogue with their unconscious, your unconsciouses have a relationship, and you have a relationship with unconscious. And these have to be, as it were, open channels for true healing to go on. I'm not sure Buber would say the role of the unconscious in healing. I think he wouldn't think in those terms. But, correct me.
No, I think he has no place for it.
Yeah.
And he uses the term it seems to me, but it's a question as much as a statement. It seems to me that he uses the term unconscious, maybe consciously, in a meaning that is very different from the meaning that it had acquired in Freudian analysis and also in Jungian analytical psychology. And I don't know why, but in order to make a point that the I-thou. So if I'm in an I-thou relation with someone, what about this unconscious material? What about you saying the
Well, I think Buber would say that when you embrace the person, you embrace them all of them, including their unconscious.
Yeah.
And Buber presumably doesn't want to draw such a sharp distinction between the conscious and the unconscious, so that in the role of the meeting, and it's there in that paper that we read for this, he's not interested in confirming the person. He's also interested in the potentiality of who someone can become. So that in the meeting, he's not simply addressing the unconscious as somehow the source of repressed feeling that needs to be surfaced. And in some way, Buber challenges classical, particularly Freudian analysis for that very assumption. He regards it as mechanistic. And it's partly mechanistic because if in the framing of a therapeutic relationship, it's seen in terms of, and Henry talked about this, if it's seen in terms of interpretation of transference, then there's a way that the analyst is often caught because not wanting to interfere with the transference in any way often fixes the analyst because they don't want to. They're worried about if they express anything about themselves more personally, that might interrupt with the possibility of the transference working. So Buber, in some way, with the Rogers work, understands actually the strength also post-analytic, both Jungian but also post-analytical traditions that don't draw those sharp distinctions and says, look, it's me in this relationship with whoever I might be working with as a teacher or as a therapist. I have to be there in the meeting, not simply as a source of interpretation, but it's who I am that makes it. It's exactly in a similar way, Leo Beck said the same thing about the rabbi is not it's not the teaching that matters, it's who the human being is. And who the human being is as the rabbi will be the most important thing in his or her training. And then the question is, what does it mean to be a human being in a relationship? And Buber doesn't want to break it into your split between the conscious and the unconscious. It's like bringing all of yourself into the encounter, into the relationship as part of the healing. So I'm wondering, so the question to Henry is then, in what way does working as a Jungian analyst give you more space? Are you more or less engaged with the authority of the transference relationship? And in what way does it allow you more space to somehow enter into the trusting relationship? That because it's very hard to trust someone, even as a therapist, if they're like removed and they're a source of knowledge or expertise or theory. What does it mean to kind of be in a meeting and be able to trust? I mean, most people don't trust their analysts. They're in defense against them. They don't trust them.
We're going to let Henry respond now, and then we're going to Katrina.
Okay, well, I think this is a point where I feel, why it's easy for me to be Jungian. Jung felt that analysts should be themselves and not hide behind some illusory blank screen, which never existed, because withholding your personality conveys a lot. For instance, Freudians often have rooms that are like very white and empty, as though it's a better place to have projections on them. But if you look at Freud's office, it was completely massive, overly crowded with his little statues and religious things and so forth. He was nothing like what he wrote about. In fact, Freud apparently was much more dialogical than Freud in writing.
Yeah.
He would loan money to patients. He would go on holiday with patients. He was much more of a mensch, as it were. So I think also there is this issue, because in a sense, the Freudian model says the analyst should be static and replaceable. And that's just nonsense. I think I mentioned, and Buber certainly mentioned, you've come to this person at this time. There's a sense of destiny. There should be a destiny sense in any good therapeutic relationship, that it's this person you've come to. They have to be there. Jung also said something which I think Buber would approve of. He said you have to invent a new therapy for each patient. You can't rely on a standard mode. He didn't mean wild therapist and so forth, but to kind of be related to what this person needs and not loyalty to the theory, which is, I think, the real I-it danger.
Thanks very much. That's a really important remark. Yeah.
Helpful.
Yeah, Katrina.
Yes, thank you. Such a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a bit more about tikkun in the context of ecotherapy and what you were saying about that we can think about Buber's I thou in the relationship to nature and healing the relationship to nature. There was something you said about you cannot now build a psychiatric hospital without a healing garden. And I heard this almost as a shock. It went through me as a jolt. So I'm joining from Ireland, and there's a big confrontation now in Ireland with the carceral culture that dominated for decades after the founding of the state, where the mentally ill were locked away. And that's all come to light now with recent reports, and it's something that's been confronted. But coming back to the eco-therapeutic tikkun, and the fact that eco-anxiety now and guilt can have this Cain-like feeling of being too great to bear.
Yes.
That the confrontation with the realities of climate catastrophe can be too great to bear. And so there's a shielding or a blocking away from that. Where do you see the potential, or what conversations are happening among Jungians and therapists now about how can we approach these questions in a way that would help us to heal and help each other?
Well, I think there are two separate questions. One is that I think Jungians have a very optimistic view that they say healing is a natural process. The way I think Buber thought engaging in dialogue was a natural process. Other things would tear it away and so forth. So if we create the natural, I think it was mentioned before very, very well, if we create the conditions, we often use this Greek word, the temenos, the kind of sacred center, a place of healing, which could be in the office, or it could be in the garden, or it could be on the forest, whatever. Then, as it were, you can restart this process which has been blocked and reconnect it. We think that people who are sick, it's as if they project the healthy part of themselves on the therapist or on other people. And so the therapist has to reconnect the healthy part of themselves with the wounded part of themselves, and in a way give it back to the patient so they can put it together. About incarceration, I mean, this is a terrible issue. It was ideological and not really therapeutic. Very few people need to be restrained, and certainly only for very short times, and never be left alone. I mean, this is one of the worst things. This is the worst thing we do to people. The worst criminals, we put them in isolation, for punishment. And this happens to mental patients on a regular basis, that they would put in, say, wet pack, which is like a wet sheets that tie you down. You can't even move, you can't pee, you can't do anything, and left alone, abandoned. I mean, even today in Jerusalem, I have a patient who went through this. He's very traumatized by this. Fortunately, we have a very humanistic alternative now in Jerusalem, Soteria, which helps young people go through psychosis with a minimum of medication in a much more open atmosphere, the minimum restraints that you would need, not the maximum restraints of this type of thing. Also, it's clearly we need new models for treating with the, severely mentally ill people, a new way of doing it. So there were Artie Lang, who I mentioned, he developed some things which his project didn't continue, but other people have tried to found therapeutic communities of different sorts, of different models. And Buber was very big on community, not being isolated. It was, again, something natural to be part of a community. So there's a lot of thinking and work about therapeutic communities. I said animal therapy. This has been extremely effective for, I mean, if you have a pet, you probably know, how important a pet can be for somebody. And if you're like an elderly, demented person, so often being able to pet, a dog can be the highlight of your week.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and that might be an example of this unconscious as the whole. I shouldn't use the word organism, but that which is alive in this particular creature, and we have a direct relationship with it that is not mediated by language. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. First, we have a question by Anastasia, and then Federico.
Thanks, Henry, and feel free to be brief because I know you have to shoot off in 15 minutes. I really enjoyed your presentation and also your paper, and I just wanted to probe you further on this expression or this conceptualization that you developed in your joint paper on the malignant mismeeting. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to focus on the malignancy, the harmful aspects of the erasure of dialogue when it comes to the dialogic relationship, especially in relation to othering processes. When we talk about instances of those individuals or groups who are either silenced and they don't have a voice to contribute to the dialogic, or when they do have a dialogic relationship, they're often misread and rejected. Women, in some cases, refugees, asylum seekers, sometimes are perceived in terms of their logos, the dialogue, as nonsensical. And then usually the practitioner, the therapist, or the medical professional in that case takes over to interpret what is useful for them. So what is your particular understanding of malignancy and harm in this context?
Well, I think what you're talking about is I mean, unforgivable. I because I combine psychology and anthropology, I'm very interested in transcultural psychotherapy and working with refugees and so forth. And this is just, you know, it's bad medicine and it's bad therapy and it's stigmatizing them and has nothing to do with you know, it's abuse. It's abuse. So that I would just say about that. You asked a specific question. But malignant mismeeting. Yes, I mean, here we did I think we took malignant because that's a term in medicine, but I think there are malignant mismeetings all the time. I'm trying to think of some of the things, you know, again from the therapy world, of like, sometimes I hear things that are so unbelievable. Like, this patient comes into his therapist and says, I want to commit suicide. Here's my suicide note. So the therapist takes the note and says, oh, there's a problem here with the grammar. So the guy goes out and kills himself. You know, that's a malignant mismeeting. Or I'm trying to think of, I think the issue is malignant, not just it's painful, because we have painful interactions all the time, because we have expectations that aren't going to be met from people, but that the consequences are very, very bad. So that's why we were using malignant. Trying to think of another good example. Again, another one from therapy. This person is in therapy and they're doing really well. And they said, you know, I think it's time for me to leave. I feel so good. I feel you've helped me so much. And they say, oh, just do try. And stupidly, they stayed around for another 2 years. You know, or it can't be just like when you know, or you know, say you have a romantic relationship and just something happens, and then it's like an ending, like just it's so bad, it's an ending, it's an ender. So that's a malignantness, maybe.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Rick, I'm coming to you in a minute. So if I can just quickly build on that. So here the question becomes, it would be interesting to see from a Buberian point of view, what is needed for the therapist to be able to say the right thing. Because one thing can in a particular context be malignant and in another context can be not malignant.
Well,
and
that's
so
true.
for example,
yeah, right. Yeah, that's the basis. Go on.
Go on. No, please.
Well, that's the basis. You know, there's a school of psychoanalysis called intersubjective, and it highlights how the experience of the patient and the therapist can be quite different, and you play off that, you work off that distinction between the others. But you know, as therapists, we have all these cute lines like, "Well, what do you think?"
Yes, exactly. And you know, it's, if I can tell just very brief from my own Lacanian analysis, where very often the remark is there's something wrong with the grammar, but but it means a lot more there. But I was telling about a traumatic thing in my past, and there was a session about it, and the next session I was feeling a lot better because I had been able to voice it. And then my analyst listens to me, says nothing, and then comes with a remark. So everything you told me last time, what bothers you the most? And so that, for me, that was terrible because it brought me back to what I thought in the time in between these sessions I had found a way to deal with. Yeah. But of course, from her point of view, from the analytic, from her analytic training, as it were, it was all bad one week, all good the next week. So she wanted to probably pull me back to what was going on there. And you can see how the reasoning might work. How would that work from the point of view of the IDAO dialogue?
Well, you know, there was a very great psychiatrist, Wilfred Bion, who created group therapy in World War II because he couldn't treat individuals. So he just started treating groups of disturbed soldiers and invented group therapy, all of which is descended from his famous book, Experiences in Groups. But he was also a great theoretician and apparently quite a decent decent guy. And he said you should enter the session without memory and without desire.
Yeah. So that would mean not saying, oh, about last week.
Well, I would never talk about last week unless there's something was like urgent, pressing, like they were wanting to kill themselves, unless they raised it. You know?
Yeah,
so that was a mismeeting.
Of course, and this is what I mean. Here you see the unconscious. Somebody might say, if I'm attentive to the unconscious, him coming back and saying, "Oh, I feel so good," is a way of saying, "I actually don't feel so good." and I wonder. So just like the Freudian slip, I wonder where the attentiveness for those aspects of psychic functioning, where they lie within the dialogical model.
Right. Well, I think the dialogical model is like, even for Buber, it's like a relation in depth. So, like one of the things that's different for Zoom therapy is like you see the person's face in a close-up that you don't see them in a normal room. Yeah. But when you're sitting with them, you would pay attention to their face, to whether they have glasses, or whether they had a hairdo or a haircut, or at the same time you'd be listening to what they're saying and how they're saying and reading the music, as it were. At the same time, like Jung, he was very strong at saying the natural language of the psyche is not words but images. So you'd be attentive to the images that would be coming up while the person's saying. And you'd be relating to them. You might, if there was a somatic feeling, you might do it. So you'd have all of these things at once. And yes, the art is to choose whether to say nothing, to be silent, but in a good way, or to kind of like choose the right tune from like an entire organ, which pedal, which key you're going to press. And that's the art of psychotherapy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay, good, great, thanks. Two questions. First, Federico, then Emily. And we are aware that we have 7 minutes and then you need to go.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to frame it in a very brief, although maybe banal way. So it's a question about morality and what happens within therapy if the moral tenets of the therapist are different from that of the client. You mentioned before in your talk the problem of guilt, and you did the distinction between guilty feelings and actual guilt. What if this distinction is perceived in a different way between the analyst and the client? How to maintain an I-thou relation when one doesn't feel is guilty or vice versa? So this is how to deal with these situations.
Right. Okay, well, that's a very common situation. What is unique about therapy is it's a palace of non-judgment. Even when people are telling you terrible things, your job is not to judge them. If you feel very strongly that this person is doing there are certain things that by law we have to report, like child abuse, elder abuse. We're not talking about things like that, but things that just seem so wrong to us in this sort of way. So I would like be with them, hold it to them. If it was transcultural, often I would try to hold it to them and try to find ways, look for opportunities to bring that to consciousness, to make them deal with that in this sort of way. But I wouldn't confront them. If I felt, and I can give you a good example, if I felt I couldn't treat them because my judging feelings would be getting in the way, then I would not treat them. I would refer them. I would do something else. For instance, I treat Palestinians, I treat Orthodox Jews. I could not treat a settler. I just couldn't. I wouldn't be able to put it aside because, it would be too involved in a negative way. So I think it is important. And this is also a big difference between medicine. In medicine, we must treat everybody.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Terrorists, we must treat everybody. As therapists, we have a lot of luxury to choose who we want. I've treated a lot of people who've been sexually abused. It's very different treating somebody who's the sexual abuser. But they need help too. And they may need this process of tikkun.
Thanks very much. And maybe Maurice Friedman's notion of the touchstone has something to do with this. Maybe we can look at that after you have left. So Emily, last question for you.
I was wondering about the issue of free association, and I think that from what I read, Buber is not very positive about this Freudian use of free associations. He seemed to say there is no such thing as free association. What do you think of this?
Well, I think he was against free association, and as a Jungian, it's not the right model, because the free association was like something you had to do. And if you weren't doing it, you were defending against the unconscious, and therefore you were bad. That was the kind of Freudian setup. So free association, even though it's like it should be what I do want for my patients is to feel emotional freedom to say whatever they want to feel. And that's the unique thing about therapy. But just to say whatever comes in your mind, I think you're right that Buber wasn't. Where's the dialogue if you're just free associating? Okay, so thank you all very much. It's been a lovely encounter, even on Zoom.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
Thanks very much. Let's give our speaker a hand. Thank you very much for coming in to us. Yeah, good. And also thank you very much for taking all those questions so rapidly one after another.
I love like a good Buberian. I love questions.
That's great.
So,
good. And
shalom.
Shalom, and come back again.
Good, lovely. I would love to. Bye.
It'd be lovely to see you again.
Okay.
Can we have a 2-minute break?
Yes, we'll have a 4-minute break until 5:30, and then we'll start to the last half hour. Okay.
Hi.
Yeah. I don't think everyone's back yet. Oh, people are coming.
Lovely.
Yeah, it was very, very good. Wonderful. Thanks very much, Paul, for suggesting this. It's very, very instructive. I think I'm going to mute you as you eat your apple. Okay, let's pick it up again. I thought, well, maybe we can sort of push things a little bit further, for the sake of clarity. The point about free association, that was the last thing that we raised, that Emily raised, which of course is a very important method in a lot of sort of psychoanalytically inspired psychotherapy. And while it is maybe true that there was a kind of authorial voice in Freudian analysis around you were bad if you didn't free associate, or rather the point of the analysis is to get people to feel you become more able to free associate as you overcome blockages, but these blockages need free association to be identified. There's a kind of trace reading of the unconscious going on in that kind of analysis, and to say that where's the dialogue if you are free associating? Yes, and we can see from the point of view of Buber's thought that is problematic, and I think this is sort of, that's why I like that question very much. Is precisely what was my interest in sort of highlighting and exploring. Where do we want to go, or do we have to make a choice at all? If we are engaged in this kind of reading of what somebody is saying or doing, not being aware of what they are doing, we need theories in order to do that. That's maybe Freud's point. Otherwise, we can't. We go into an area where we don't know our way about. Is there a place for that in the I-thou relation? Is it maybe the case that the I-thou relation is necessary for that kind of dialogue to occur, or for that kind of analytical work to occur? Or is that kind of analytical work does that happen in the space for the I-it? And can it therefore maybe be part of a kind of treatment the way that Henry has just explained it to us in a very clear way? Or is it just, does it just not enter into the realm of dialogue? Seems to me to be still a question. And if I can just show you, it relates, and we'll also get into Federico's point about morality, which I think is important. Just wanted to show you from this article by Maurice Friedman that I also put in the folder on Buber and dialogical psychotherapy, where we get this is Friedman talking, but you can find pretty much same things in the text on the unconscious, where we get sort of a statement of Buber's view of the unconscious, and you will have seen that I already mentioned it before, but I thought it might be good for us to have a bit of a look at it and see what is going on there. So Buber sees the unconscious as the wholeness of the person before the differentiation and elaboration into psychic and physical inner and outer. Freud, and after him Jung, made the simple logical error of assuming that the unconscious is psychic because they denied that it was physical. They did not, Buber held, see this third alternative, and with it the possibility of bursting the bounds of psychologism, psyche, and the physical need not apply to the unconscious. Here, in contrast, there might be direct meeting and communication between one unconscious and another. It seems to me that that would explain why free association would not be so important in this view of the unconscious, because there is no mediation through language that you could read, or through images, or through any kind of order that you could interrogate as to its hidden motivations or causes. But it also makes it, that's what he then goes on to say. It makes it really impossible to sort of talk about it or do anything with it, because it can never become conscious. It is the wholeness of our being that is always there, is always at work, but that cannot be dealt with in any other way than either by looking at it through the mode of the body, or looking at it through the mode of the mind, so the psyche, in various forms of encounter that we have. But it cannot become a direct object of knowledge, because it is not an object. And I just wanted to point out, and I think Friedman makes that point too, and in the text it also comes back, Buber says it himself, this is very reminiscent of Kant, of course, and we talked earlier about the way in which the Buber's thinking in I and Thou seems to sort of be grafted onto a Kantian notion of a thing in itself and its appearances, and the human person as that which stands behind, which is the guarantee of the moral order, which cannot be reduced to the phenomena themselves. And it struck me that here there is also a very strong reference to Spinoza. And remember that we talked about Descartes and how important Cartesian thinking was for Buber, how much he, that was what I proposed, how much he defined his own thinking in terms of a kind of implicit relation to Descartes, pointing out that the cogito, the thinking, I think, therefore I am, does not exist in isolation, but exists in relation. And I guess you could say that the I-Thou relationship is very much like that. It's a kind of Cartesian, it's a kind of dialogic version of Cartesianism. But if you then, so you could say it's kind of radicalization of Cartesianism. And if you then look at Spinoza, who comes right after Descartes, of course, Spinoza says the substance, God, or nature, that which is one, which makes the world one, or the oneness of things, is unknowable and has two modes that can be known by us, may have many more, but we don't know about them. One is extension, so it's the body, and the other is mind, is spirit. There's a perfect parallelism between the two, but we know them as two distinct modes, and we know that they are modes of the substance, as he calls it, that we can't know. But that's how it works. And the substance is just desire to be, is conatus, is drive to be in a way. So I guess it's not too far-fetched probably to say that on the one hand there is this dialogic rendering of the cogito, which we see in I and Thou, and on the other hand there is this dialogic rendering of the basic Spinozist scheme of the oneness of mind and body in a way that we cannot grasp. And that is then what he calls the unconscious, which corresponds to what in Spinoza is the drive, or the conatus, which the desire to be or to continue one's being. And if you look at it like, I think there's a clear influence of Spinoza on Freud as well. But if you look at it like this, you can maybe begin to see a little bit what he is trying to, why he feels that pointing out this unity of body and mind is a useful thing to do. Sorry, Emily, you had a comment, please.
It down, I know from my own experience that if that I'm in direct contact with my unconscious, without which I cannot write. So I don't think that the unconscious is inaccessible. And I think that language and the way we use language is a bridge between the unconscious through the pre-conscious, where all the symbols are accumulated, and syntax and grammar to the conscious world. So, I mean, it could be one, the physical, the physical and the mental, but that it is intangible, I don't believe. It's not true,
Yes, and well, yes, I can see what you mean, and perhaps it only makes sense on a strong, I want to say almost a strong Kantian reading of what the unconscious might be. It almost becomes, or maybe also Schopenhauerian will or so. It becomes something like that, something that can never be experienced directly, but only in its manifestations. But these manifestations can then not be taken as they don't tell you what it is, they just tell you that it's there. The unconscious is a state out of which the physical and the psychical have not yet evolved, and in which the two cannot be distinguished from each other. The unconscious is our being itself in its wholeness. And again, I note that it seems that there's a question how this relates to the wholeness of the I-Thou relationship, which is also one of, out of it, the physical and psychic evolve again and again and at every moment. The unconscious is not a phenomenon. It is what modern psychology holds it to be, a dynamic fact that makes itself felt by its effects a psychologist can explore. So something that makes itself felt by its effects, but it cannot be grasped directly, that is what we call a force, right? If I'm correct. So it's
libido.
Yeah, libido, a force or a virtue, or it's the vis dormitiva, right? Which makes the sleeping potion put you to sleep because it's got a dormitive force in it. So you can see the critique of psychologism or psychology and in positivism there taking shape as well. If you cannot experience it, then why are you postulating it? But this exploration, as it takes place in psychiatry, is not of the unconscious itself, but rather of the phenomena that have been dissociated from it. So that seems to imply that psychiatry deals with the fragmented side of life. We cannot say anything about the unconscious in itself. It is never given to us. The radical mistake that Freud made was to think that he could posit a region of the mind as unconscious and at the same time deal with it as if its contents were simply repressed conscious material that could be brought back without any essential change into the conscious. So well, I guess what I'm saying is if we take that seriously, then this experience, Emily, that you describe of being in touch with your unconscious, I don't know what it could mean then. It could probably only mean that you feel good in yourself and you feel in touch with a life force or something like that. But there would be no way in which there would be no place for an analytical investigation of what is going on in this unconscious.
But it's not true because, in this paragraph, he is completely denying the curative position or the curative mission, of psychotherapy. And it is not true. It is proven, Freud proved that with psychotherapy, your repressed unconscious material becomes conscious. And that by becoming conscious, you do not repeat it, you see. But Buber is coming against it, So Freud and Buber are two irreconcilable, I would say, positions.
If we go to I wanted to sort of push it a little bit to say, okay, well, maybe certainly from the Freudian side, the Jungian side is a bit of a different story, but there seem to be quite conflicted views of what the unconscious is, seem to be at work there. Yeah. Peter, are you holding up your hand?
Yeah, please. I think the difference is in a theory of energetics, in the sense that Buber's theory is a theory of subjectivity, isn't it, or individuation. And this theory of individuation is based upon partly the energy deriving from this unconscious, isn't it? But in contrast, the sort of Freudian approach is a different theory of energetics. And I think maybe the difference is also to do with the way in which Buber interprets his, how would you say, kind of intellectual and conceptual heritage, as opposed to the theory of sort of psychoanalysis and its development, because he is quite, in those extracts, he's also quite insistent upon a type of methodological precision, isn't he, whereby both Freud and Jung are considered by Buber to have overstepped the limits of this sort of a methodological sort of how you might call it, kind of prerequisites for a theory of the unconscious, aren't they?
Yes, I think that's
there's also a kind of further point, which is that does Buber have a theory of pathology? Because although he talks about the sort of Freudian repression, this return of the sort of unaltered elements of the unconscious, Buber has a theory of evil, but he doesn't have a theory of pathology, does he?
That's a very good question, I guess. Yeah? There is, so remember that Henry spoke about, is it your inner voice or is it the devil that's talking in your head? And that we had the idea that a person is not sick alone. So that mental illness is often pathology in that sense. So I mean, you know, there seems to be the claim or the idea that pathology is relational, and that fits in with certain movements in anti-psychiatry as well, R.D. Laing and people like that. Who is sick, me, or society. And in that sense, you might say that there is certainly a notion of. It's actually a very, very good question, I think. There's certainly a notion of social pathology, and I mean, you know, partly the sort of the implicit social critique that we find in a lot of Buber's writings about modernity could be construed as a theory of social pathology, right? There is the I-it encroaches upon more and more terrains of life and reduces the possibility for dialogue and therefore for communal living. So in that sense, there is pathology, but psychopathology is a different matter. It might be interesting here I just wanted to show you that to quickly go to this idea of the touchstones that you may have picked up. I mentioned it just at the end of Henry's talk, and it relates also to Federico's point, because this question of pathology is everything to do with the moral order. I highlighted it. So a good article actually by Friedman. He says that he lists all these elements that dialogic psychotherapy has, and then he comes to the end, 10 factors. We've gone over them. It starts with guilt and others as well that we have seen, and then he comes at number 10, and that is the dialogue of touchstone. So this word touchstone is not a Buberian word, but it's a word that Friedman introduces. But this has to do with the fact that, and I thought that was nice, and that specifies maybe a kind of relation to Freudian or to psychoanalysis. That there comes a moment in the treatment or in the analysis or in your own life where you realize what is important to you. You might say what your values are, and that you and of your capacity to live by those or not. And Friedman suggests that this is a kind of operationalization of this idea that you're not sick alone. It suggests that mental illness occurs when people are not able to be at once loyal to their touchstones and at the same time remain in communication with others. So he says here, the dialogue of touchstones. This element takes up into itself inclusion and confirmation, those things we talked about before. Through his or her greater experience in inclusion and imagining the real, the therapist enables the patient to go beyond the terrible either-or of remaining true to one's unique touchstones of reality at the cost of being cut off from the community, or entering into a relation with the community at the cost of denying one's touchstones. The therapist must help the patient bring his or her touchstones of reality into dialogue with other persons, beginning with the therapist himself. Touchstones of reality and the dialogue of touchstones offer an alternative to the either-ors, objective versus subjective, absolute versus relative, mind versus body, and the rejection of the schizophrenic versus romantic glorification of him or her. And I think then here the terrible dilemma of the sick person is having to choose between giving up his touchstones, that which which is the real for you, in order to communicate, or giving up communication in order to retain one's unique touchstones. Such a person needs the help of someone who can glimpse and share the unique reality that has come from this person's life experience, and help this person find a way of bringing it into the common order of existence so that he or she too may raise what is being experienced as I into the communal reality of we. Such persons need help of a therapist who can imagine the real and practice inclusion to help them enter into the dialogue of touchstones. So dialogue becomes then the dialogue of touchstones. My unique experience that has made me into I, who I am, is something that I can then own and bring into a relation with others who don't have to share my touchstones, but a relation of mutual acknowledgement would be the basis of the communal relation that would then guarantee mental health, or would be the curing of mental illness. And it seems to me that although this takes a very different route from how Freud would describe a successful analysis, in the end maybe it is not so very different. Because with Freud and certainly in the Lacanian school you get this as well, the moment where the patient can voice their, Lacan would say, voice their desire, not give up on it, that is the moment where you can pierce through the fantasies that you've created for yourself to find a way of living with these touchstones in a world that doesn't acknowledge them. That is then also the moment where you can actually voice them and live your life the way you want to live it. And you freed yourself from the defenses and the fantasies. So in that sense, there seems to me to be a kind of parallel, and it has to do with this question of morality, because these touchstones are, I think, he uses the word touchstone, but I think these are kind of values that people have that make life livable for someone. And you can see how dialogic therapy would be a way of bringing people to an awareness of what these things are in their lives. And that could certainly be something that has to do with, it's not just about insight and interpretation, as our speaker suggested absolutely rightly, but it is more a matter of relating, because this is precisely what can happen when there is a meeting, when there is a begegnung.
But the idea that you are only ill on you can't be ill on your own, but also always in a relation, is quite a radical critique that Buber is opening up to a certain kind of Freudian psychoanalytic idea that it's somehow the patient who is ill as an individual because of his or her own repressed history that then has to be dealt with. So I thought Buber's notion of wholeness, it's the whole person, is quite a challenge to a lot of analytical traditions, and this is what Buber seems to be kind of engaging. I think what you said about Spinoza is really helpful, that when Buber talks about the wholeness of the person, even though he doesn't frame it in somatic terms, there is the idea, particularly when Buber talks about dreams in that piece, that in our dreams we're coming into contact with ourselves and with our unconscious. But when we wake, Buber says, the way that dream, the impact of the dream in the anxiety with which we might walk around the block is a way that we're carrying the dream or the influence or the impact of the dream, which doesn't necessarily show itself as the interpretation of the unconscious. So that at that level, Buber's notion of the wholeness is an embodied notion, links back to what we're talking about, relationships to nature, because often it's through our bodies that we share those relationships with nature. And there's a way that the Freudian notion absorbs emotions and absorbs the body into the mind, into basically a theory of the mind in which the unconscious is seen as an aspect of mind.
Precisely.
But in that
and
way, that's also a weakness, because it draws away from the kind of feelings that people are carrying. I've been extremely, I don't know whether I mentioned this before, but the series It's a Sin on British television, which is about growing up with a kind of gay identity.
Yeah, I watched it.
It's just an extraordinary example. I'm not going to go back over it. I now realise from Artemis's laugh that I mentioned this last time. But
no, I saw it. Now you can spoil it all you want for the others.
Now you can spoil it.
Go on.
But it's a great exploration of this kind of shame. And I was thinking about the relationship of guilt and shame, because we talked about guilt, but then how do we talk about shame? And then how is it that traditions of psychoanalysis were so anti-gay sexualities and LGBT sexualities? And do we just say, oh no, all we're doing is extending the theory into areas that it hadn't fully appreciated before? Or to what extent does that provide us with a challenge? So here's my framing of the challenge as a person who's meditated for 20 years or something and done all kinds of strange things. That the Freudian theory basically builds around the notion of the problem area in your life. You know, that you've got a problem, you've got to solve it, and it's somehow repressed in some kind of childhood past. But the analysis often remains at the level of the problem. You can't bring higher energies in, or spiritual energies in, to the healing process. So I'm very interested in kind of practices of healing, Eastern and Western traditions, which allow you to bring up higher energies into, and that's part of what Buber seems to have got from a Hasidic tradition, the idea that there are these energies that you can use in dance and in song and they're all, like we've been talking about, they're healing practices. And that's part of the healing practices that he draws out of the Hasidic tradition, in which your embodied emotional, spiritual self, you know, so that it might be that you dance. I think the only reason I think I'm still alive is that I danced a lot when I was 11 years old. And when I danced when I was 11 years old, it was a way that I was kind of dealing with my family's unspeakable Holocaust histories. Nobody could talk about it. But as I was dancing to the Everly Brothers, and I was 11 or 12 or something, it was a way that you could move certain energies. That's why the notion of energy is so important. You could move certain kinds of energies, which Buber really recognizes and acknowledges. So there was a way that, even though Buber carried, and I'd like to see what Paul feels about this, carries the kind of pain of the separation from his mother, there was a way that he had somehow found through his own life and relationships, ways in which he could in some way heal or come into a different relationship with himself that meant that he was somewhat wary of analytical traditions that focus so sharply on our emotional and traumatic histories and problems.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to be captured by that, so that Buber offers, sometimes in quite difficult language, and it's very hard to know what Buber's relationships to questions of gender and sexuality were. I'd be interested in knowing what Buber's relationship to feminist notions or gay movements that were around. They were around with Landau. They were kind of part of the culture that was around in Germany in that earlier period. What were his responses? But the notion of wholeness, this is my last bit, the notion of wholeness within post-structuralist theories has become very difficult to think. You know, any notion of wholeness is linked to an essentialist vision, and it's dismissed. So Buber's language of wholeness makes him difficult for lots of people to read in contemporary cultural framings, but he seems, through his language of wholeness, to offer a critique that could be really important for us at this moment. Sorry for the sermon.
It's even more difficult to get an academic.
Yeah.
It's even more difficult to get an academic job if you use the word wholeness in the
Yeah,
job interview.
if you went into any academic in British universities and talked about wholeness, you wouldn't be invited back for your second interview, because they would just say, oh, he's an essentialist or she's an essentialist thinker. That they'd show you the door.
Yeah, totally. Okay, thanks very much for your sermon. Indeed, that was very edifying. Yeah, no, excellent. And I think that it's a sin. If you can watch it, do it, because at the end, this point about shame and guilt becomes very, very poignant. And there is the idea that a whole generation of thinking and educating and raising children in terms of their sexuality is responsible for many of the deaths. And so there's a very, very strong message there. Anastasia, can I ask you to introduce the topic for next week before we break up? Because that has everything to do with this question of feminism and gender issues. And I'm very happy that will be able to talk about that on what is also International Women's Day on the 8th of March in 2 weeks.
I wasn't expecting that. That was a surprise. So from memory.
Yeah, sorry, no, I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want, but I thought because you will be leading the session, maybe you can just say very, very briefly announce it, but you don't have to. I can also do it.
Sure, no problem. It's great that I wasn't replying to emails and I was actually paying attention.
I knew that.
I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to have had a positive reply to my invite to Professor Deidre Butler, who's based in Ottawa, Canada, and she's also the director of the Zelikowitz Center. Deidre has a very long-term research and publication seminal profile on issues of feminism and Judaism, especially in relation to ethics and violence, as well as issues of Jewish women's divorce and the impact on Judaism Judaic relations and the family, but also issues of feminist philosophy at large. And she's been conducting for the past couple of years an ethnographic project researching the life stories and experiences of women in Canada. And her doctoral studies and earlier scholarly work has been on Buber as well. So she will combine a Buberesque kind of analysis of connecting her data, the ethnographic research, and issues of feminism, ethics, violence, politics, and Jewish studies. And it will be a combination of her presentation of her work, my probing into my particular areas of interest, and then opening up the wider platform for colleagues to ask questions, debate, query things. And that's symbolically on the 8th of March, International Women's Day.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. We're looking forward to that very much. So thanks all for today, for your participation, for joining. I hope you've all had the feeling that we learned.
Can we do anything in terms of I just wanted to, because it's in my head, what Buber's relationship to feminist and gay stuff was. I don't know whether you can say, Paul, but I was just wondering in terms of the way that the I, thou is framed, what does it mean if you think about it in gendered or difference terms, and whether Buber, through his life, basically, what his relationship with feminist things were. Just wondered that in terms of opening up also for next time. Not wanting to put you on the spot.
I'll address it just very quickly. His wife was a feminist, and his
that's
quite early. You're perhaps familiar that Buber gained his initial fame by editing a series of monographs on urban life, urban civilization, called the Gesellschaft. And within that 40 volumes, he has one on the erotic by Lou Salome, who was certainly feminist, and another essay volume on feminism. And this is all in the first decade of the 20th century.
Wow, that's really
interestingly, his granddaughter, Judith Agassi Buber, was a sociologist of what we now would call feminism. It was very much part of the family ethos, and going back initially to his wife, but he was in the forefront of those concerns.
But when the language doesn't use it in the same way, the language is more universal often, isn't it?
Certainly. And just as an aside, we want to pick up later, Landau praised Buber for being thinking like a female.
Yeah.
And as a laudatory, is that we can expand upon that, but I'll leave it to your imagination. But it was quite a remarkable comment, and Landau felt that since Buber fought like a woman, it was a breakthrough, and one that was commendable. But we'll consider that next meeting. Okay.
Yeah, we'll pick all of that up at the next meeting. We have to stop now because people need to go. But thanks very much, everyone. It was a wonderful session, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time.